Thanks, Arlen. My name is Wenimo Okoya. I'm with the JED Foundation, and I'm going to be leading you through most of the conversation today and really excited to talk to y'all about this topic. I have spent the last decade or so in education, started off my career as a classroom teacher, and long story short, have been sort of at the intersection of health and education, focused on helping schools adopt practices to support student mental health, well-being, and trauma. So really excited to talk about this topic today. I'll pass it over to Glenn Karaban, my colleague, to introduce himself and to just introduce the work that we do at JED broadly.
Great, thanks, Wenimo. Hi, I am Glenn Karaban. I'm the Director of Business Development for High School Programming at the JED Foundation. I come to JED with a long career in sales and business development in the education and the high school space. But really what brought me to the work here is I have three children, one that's been through high school, one that's in now, and one that's in middle school. So the work that we do through the JED Foundation is very meaningful, and we're thrilled to be able to meet with you today and talk to you about trauma-informed practices. I'm going to start off, though, with a little grounding on the work that we do at the JED Foundation and through JED High School. So we're going to play a really quick video for you. So JED Foundation, we're about 21 years old, and we launched in the year 2000 when our founder's son died by suicide freshman year of college, and really began the work to try and understand what can be done to help at the college level and the high school level to really create a community of care around students. And basically the mission of the JED Foundation is to protect emotional health and prevent suicide for our nation's teens and young adults. Through the work that we do, through webinars like this and some other work that we do, we partners with high schools around the country to strengthen their mental health, substance misuse, and suicide prevention programs and systems. And we do a lot of work with community awareness to help destigmatize and provide action for youth mental health. Next slide, one more. We have several programs that we work through. JED Campus is the first, where we partner with about 380 colleges, universities around the country to kind of look at their systems and policies around mental health and student supports. JED High School is our high school program, which now has about 63 high schools that we're currently partnering with to assess and strengthen their supports for student mental health. And we have a variety of other programs that you can see there: Set to Go, Seize the Awkward, Mental Health, Is Health, Love is Louder. We do a lot of work around the country to provide education and awareness around mental health and a whole variety of topics around it. The work is really grounded in, really quickly, our JED High School Comprehensive Approach, which is a framework around how to provide high schools and districts to support and improve student mental health and reduce risks in suicide, risk for suicide. It's a model that came originally from the Air Force Academy that we modified for campuses and now modified for high schools. And what we do is we work on 7 core domains that we know all interrelate to provide a safety net for schools and for students around mental health. And you could just see some of the things that we do developing life skills, promoting social connectedness and a positive school climate, we encouraging help-seeking behaviors, ensuring student access to effective mental health treatment, establishing and following crisis management procedures, and then promoting means safety. And what we essentially do in the work is all schools can do this on their own, and they can. We have this available online. You can see what the actual comprehensive approach looks like. And we also, through the JED High School program, work with schools in over 2-year periods to really assess and strengthen each of these 7 core domains and create a sustainable program for their schools and for their students. It's a technical assistance model. That's just kind of a general framework of where we're coming from here, but now Wenimo is going to take you into the presentation.
Thanks so much, Glenn. And I'm lucky enough to be supporting the implementation of the JED High School Comprehensive Approach. And so our conversation today really lives in this part of our comprehensive approach around promoting social connectedness and positive school climate. So we recognize using trauma-informed educational practices as essential to creating a positive school climate for young people and one where they feel connected. Because if teachers, school leaders, et cetera, are not considering trauma, school can't possibly be a safe place psychologically for young people. So just going to run you through really quickly our agenda for today's conversation. And please, as we're talking, please put questions in the chat and we can get to them later so that you don't forget. If you're like me, Zoom has done something really incredible to my brain where I can't retain information at all. So please ask questions as you go or jot them down so you don't forget. So we'll go through a little bit about the national mental health landscape for young people. We'll talk about what trauma is, and many of you already know what that is, but just want to start with a common definition. Talk about how trauma affects students. Talk about how COVID has impacted trauma, talk a little bit about racial trauma and contextualize that. Have a conversation about resilience, because I think sometimes that gets left out of the conversation and we end up super depressed about trauma because it feels inevitable that young people have experienced it. And then we'll end with some practices and things that can be implemented in schools. And we always close with reflection so you can really think about how this can play out in your practice. So to begin, and you can put this in the chat, or if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can just jot this down on a piece of paper. But I'd like for you to think of 3 traits of a positive adult role model that you had when you were a young person. So think of 3 traits of one of your positive adult role models. So think of a teacher, a parent, a neighbor, a counselor, whoever that positive role model might have been, and write down 3 traits of that person. So I've got honest, patient, calm. Awesome. Calm again, consistent, kind, believed in me, relatable, trustworthy, caring, patient, knowledgeable, exudes confidence, resilient. Yeah, we'll provide the presentation at the end. Patient, flexible, helpful, responsible, good listener, caring, connected, compassionate, and open, encouraging, friendly, honest. Yeah, a lot of these resonate with me, and you see that a lot of them are repeating. I'm going to point out non-judgmental, right? So authentic, listening, genuine, communicative, open, encouraging is coming up again. So keep dropping them in the chat and think about those. So these, many of us think about humble, certainly, right? All of us can think back to when we were young people ourselves and think about the people who really helped us to overcome difficult times and that we looked up to and that we felt safe and connected to. So I want you to keep this in mind because, while the term trauma-informed feels really lofty and really difficult to implement, I can imagine that those people were actually applying a lot of the strategies that we're going to be talking about today. They might not have known that it was trauma-informed and that buzzword might not have existed, but those are all trauma-informed strategies, and those are things that we all have within us. So being trauma-informed does not take much more than being willing to make connections with young people that are meaningful, authentic, and make them safe. And they're really important for mitigating trauma and building resilience with young people. So we all have it within us, and we've all experienced it ourselves. Just to kind of demystify that a little bit. Some quick information about youth mental health in the current moment. So about 20% of teens across the country experience a mental health challenge. And these are pre-COVID stats. So research has shown that that COVID has obviously exacerbated mental health challenges. Depression and anxiety are really high and are rising, especially amongst marginalized groups of young people. And almost 50% of young people at the age of 17 underreport experiencing at least one trauma, right? 17 underreport experiencing at least one trauma. So we know that the exposure of trauma for young people is really high for the young people that we're dealing with. So we can almost say that we can use a trauma-informed approach with all kids. We don't have to be cherry picking and figuring out which one of our students have experienced trauma. This is an approach that's safe and effective with all young people. And we know that COVID and the social unrest of 2020 and what we're experiencing right now with Ukraine and everything that's going on our world is only exacerbating and is exposing young people and us and families to even more trauma. So trauma is inevitable and definitely, but definitely intervenable. And this is why this presentation is really important. So I'd like for y'all to participate in this poll really quickly. And so in order to participate, you can either text high school PO389, text that number 23333, or you can go to pollev.com/high school PO389. I think the texting is easier and you can put your response in there. But if you'd rather put in the browser, you can do that. Glenn, if you don't mind and you have access to the chat, could you type the URL into the chat so folks can click on that? Thanks. So what is trauma in your own words? We can sort of get on the same page about the definition of this word that gets thrown around a lot. Harm, simply put. Oh, people are putting in the chat. That's cool too. Stress, past offenses that have affected us negatively, disruptive of what would have been. I like that. Event or circumstance that may be out of the control of the victim that had a negative effect, an experience that causes pain, stress, discomfort, anxiety, pain, fear, worry, negative experiences, an incident that cannot be forgotten or let go by someone. People being mean, teasing could be a form of trauma, depending on the young person. Confusion, something that impacts the way we interact with your world, your surrounding, other people. Reconstructs thought processes, experience that causes issues living in our lives, an unexpected situation. Damage, harm, I would say, along with the same lines. So keep those coming and keep typing them into the chat if folks have other definitions that they'd like to share. So here's negative experiences, impactful human experience. So y'all are familiar with this term, right? But you'll notice that there are tons of ways of describing this. So I just wanted to get us on the same page in terms of a definition of trauma. So the way that we'll define it is it's an extremely overwhelming and sometimes debilitating reaction to an event or experience that is hard to process or cope with, like sexual assaults, violence, repeated abuse, near-death experiences, etc. Something that I will point out is the difference between trauma and toxic stress, and why it's important for us to intervene on trauma is that trauma exposure doesn't necessarily cause negative health outcomes or doesn't cause toxic stress. It's when there isn't the presence of a buffering adult that trauma is converted into toxic stress. So human beings are resilient and we're able to tolerate high amounts of stress, and our nervous systems are wired for it. But really, the biggest determinant between whether or not one overcomes adversity or if that trauma has debilitating effects on one's life moving forward is the presence of a positive buffering adult, which is why we started with those positive traits of young people. So the kind of, old saying that like you can be the change in a young person's life, that's backed by science, and that's really actually what's necessary in order for us to overcome trauma. But what does trauma do to the brain, right? So I mentioned the nervous system, and a lot of folks mentioned the long-term impacts. If we don't intervene on trauma, it can have permanent impacts and long-lasting impacts on the brain, especially when the trauma exposure is prior to the end of adolescence, which actually happens at the age of 24. So those of you that have kids that are in their 20s and still act a little off, it's because their brains are not fully developed. So give them a little bit of a chance to get there. But trauma has an impact on the brain because it changes the way that our prefrontal cortex develops. So if you imagine that my fist is a brain, the prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that's responsible for executive functioning. So that's the front of our brain here. And then underneath here, we have our amygdala, which is responsible for our emotions. So it's very easy for young people, because their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, to flip their lid, which means that you're going to get an emotional response from young people if they're feeling aggravated or stressed. What happens when a brain develops in the context of trauma is that the prefrontal cortex never fully develops, and a person who's experienced a lot of trauma flips their lid pretty easily, which is why their actions come across as very dysregulated and abnormal. So what we want to do is give young people who have experienced trauma the ability to de-escalate and allow their prefrontal cortexes to calm down when we're sharing information, which is why exposure to trauma, if not dealt with, has an impact on executive functioning and learning, because young people are spending the entire day like this with their amygdala or the emotional brain exposed. You can't learn when your brain's like this. You need your brain like this to learn. And when you're exposed to trauma and triggers that remind you of the trauma or make you feel unsafe, you spend the entire school day like this. And we need young people in our seats like this. And so the practices we're talking about allow us to make sure that young people's brains look like this when they're in front of us. That's a little bit of brain science. So now I think many of us at this point, the term adverse childhood experiences has been much more popularized than it had been several years ago, even though the research dates back to 1997, actually. But what the adverse childhood experience study told us is that exposure to these types of adverse childhood experiences, abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, has a direct correlation with negative health outcomes. So they found that people in this study who had experienced these things in childhood had higher rates of cancer, diabetes, obesity, mental health challenges, high risk taking behaviors, alcoholism, et cetera, et cetera. So what we know is that exposure to adverse childhood experiences can have a significant impact on the way the brain and the body develops in adulthood. So we want to intervene as early as possible to make sure that young people can overcome their adversity rather than sort of being succumbed to what we know can happen when there's early exposure to trauma or adverse childhood experiences. So I'm going to take a little bit of a breath there. And I want to talk about what this looks like in schools. And I think many of you might be aware of this because you work in schools, right? So share in the chat how this shows up in your schools. Young people who have experienced trauma, how is it showing up in the classroom? How is it showing up in your students' work? What are you seeing in front of you? So I'd like people to spend a little bit of time sharing. Absence certainly showing up in attendance and engagement. Yep, and their ability to focus and their ability to complete work, disruptions in the classroom, aggression, non-trusting, behavior issues, outbursts, poor treatment of other students, all of this for sure. And I'm sure many of us are seeing these rising in our schools because we've all gone through and are still going through this massive collective trauma called COVID. So tears, yep, sometimes it shows up in their emotions and defiance because their brains don't feel safe. Defensiveness, absolutely. Keep them coming. But I'm going to share what's on our slide. So all of what you're saying is totally true, and it's making me think that we need to add to this slide because that's definitely how that shows up in terms of young people's behavior. But it has significant impacts on school performance, right? So we think that folks brought up absences, but addition, lower GPA, decreased reading ability, more expulsions and suspensions due to many of the behaviors in our behavioral and our consequences in schools due to when young people show up with these sorts of behaviors in the classroom. More often than not, exposure to trauma is oftentimes diagnosed as ADHD. So because we haven't really implemented trauma-informed practices broadly, oftentimes rather than giving students support for their exposure to trauma and creating a trauma-informed environment, what we do is label them as ADHD because they have impulsive behavior or they're inattentive, so on and so forth. A lot of what you all described here. But these are some of the metrics and how they show up in their work and their school performance, but you'll have done a good job outlining what those behaviors look like in the classroom. And some of these, right, warning signs. So students might express having headaches or stomach aches that are unexplained and not tied directly to physical health issues, unpredictable behavior, being irritable, aggressive, having reckless behavior, making poor decisions, being impulsive, jumpiness or being really quick to startle because they're nervous and their nervous systems are really escalated, and being disinterested in activities in school or things that they were interested prior. Folks who have been experienced with trauma have a higher threshold for pleasure than people who haven't been exposed to trauma. So they oftentimes come across as disinterested, more disinterested than students who haven't been exposed to trauma. So let's talk a little bit about how COVID has impacted this. And you all could probably guess what's on this slide, but just thought it'd be good to put it in the context of the current moment. Because of the increased stress from the pandemic and the inequitable access to resources and the disproportionate impact on COVID-19 on certain communities, particularly communities of color, it's created a lot of trauma for young people, a lot of uncertainty, a lack of stability for young people and their families. It's impacted folks' financial issues in certain areas. Families have been broken apart and divided. People have moved to different areas. There's been so much uncertainty in the last 2 years. We're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of my last day in a school, which is March 13, 2020. So this is 2 years that we've been in the midst of this. And students might not even be able to identify this as trauma or what the source of the trauma is, but they've got this sense of ambiguous loss that they can't describe, and it's affecting their behaviors, their interactions with other people, their families, their peers, etc. So it's pretty normal what they're experiencing, and it's important to teach them about that pretty explicitly, that, you know, your brain is developing, you're going through a lot. It's important that we support you because this is what we're experiencing is not normal. And there are some populations that are at higher risk than others. So I think it's important to mention that. So in particular, about half of Latina students and more than 60% of Black children have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. About 60% of children from low-income families have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. So these exposures to trauma are higher in certain populations than others. So it's important to think about that if you're working with a school or school district that has higher proportions of students of color or students who come from low income backgrounds. And so these challenges, racial adversity, the stressors that they've experienced only put increased mental health risk on young people. So it's really important to think about their identities. For young people who identify as LGBTQ+, especially trans young people, they are much more susceptible to exposure to trauma, discrimination, bullying, not feeling accepted in their households as well as at school. So it's important to make sure that we are paying attention to the students for whom school was not designed. First generation students, students with disabilities, students, again, living in economic adversity, not to pity them, but to recognize that they might need additional support and might need more resources for overcoming their adversities. And then I do want to just very quickly mention racial trauma because of the context of what happened in 2020 has really increased the visibility of racial trauma, but it's something that's been present in the culture of our country since its onset. So racial trauma or race-based stress, as referred to in other literature, is when people of color in the context of the United States have these real or perceived experiences of discrimination, of harm, of injury, witnessing that in other people that from their identity groups. And this is happening a lot in schools. And we really need to be aware of how, in addition to the other types of trauma I just described, students of color are experiencing this other type of trauma on top of that. And it's compounded by the events of 2020, where there are all these messaging in the media about what it means to be a person of color in the United States. So I think it's really important to put that into perspective as well. And so let's spend a second and talk about resilience. I love to talk about resilience because it's much more joyful than what I've talked about. I just told you about all these awful exposures that young people have. But I do want to include a note around resilience and the science behind resilience and the science behind neuroplasticity. So one of the really cool things about the brain is that before it fully develops, before the age of 24, it's really elastic and plastic and neuroplastic, and we can intervene on young people's brain development and really be intentional about resilience. So I think folks are familiar with the term resilience, but just to kind of point this out, and this is part of our model in terms of the development of life skills for young people, we really think it's important to build intentional resilience and give people opportunities to build that as a skill rather than being assuming that it's something that is innate or folks are born with. So, it's really the ability to bounce back from stressors, but that has to be taught and has to be built in emotionally, right? So it's how are you thinking about certain issues? How are you reframing it? What sort of skills are you building to cope with the adversity that you're experiencing? How are you seeking out supports to the people in your community to become resilient over it? Do you recognize that you can't do this alone, right? You're not just bouncing back by yourself, but you're looking to the resources in your community to figure out how to become resilient, right? What are kind of the environmental factors surrounding you and what's in your family history that might make it difficult for you to tolerate what you're experiencing? And being aware of that is really important for young people. And I continue to emphasize the importance of social support in terms of resilience. It is the primary factor when determining whether or not a young person can overcome adversity. Okay, so it's really important for young people to develop consistent relationships with adults who promote high expectations and encourage self-improvement. So schools can really create these opportunities for positive decision-making in their families, in young people's communities, and within their school environment. So thinking through think being really intentional about resilience is really emphasizing the opportunities for building in strong connections between young people and adults within their systems, whether it's outside of the school, in their broader community, inside the school, or bridging the gap within families. And I know that can be hard with adolescents because they're really connected to their peers at this point. So I'd like for y'all to think a little bit about resilience. So here are just some things that I've already shared, right? We're focusing on building positive relationships. We want to make sure that they're building emotional skills in the classroom. We want to identify students' strengths, make sure they have a sense of meaning and purpose. We want to celebrate the progress that they're making and help them put their success in perspective. How do you, in your context, build resilience with your students? What are some practices that you already have in place to help build resilience? And you can go ahead and share that in the chat. Growth mindset, absolutely. Making connections with them. Make a connection, build rapport, relationships. So it seems that y'all are already doing the relationship thing. Amazing. Keep doing that. More important now than ever. Supporting their efforts, cheering them on at sports events, encouraging them, being consistent. Yep, uncertainty is a massive trigger for young people who've experienced trauma. Using humor, talking about their personal lives and yours, building meaningful connections for sure. Connecting, established a GSA for the first time ever at our school, and have weekly meetings with the LGBTQIA plus and ally community. That's amazing. Thinking about that group of students and how to build connection with them and belonging and community. Providing opportunities for conversation, developing relationships with students, fostering opportunities to connect, showing them where that you're there for them, listening. Yep, adults are not naturally great at listening because we are used to solving problems and having the answers. So I see it's nice to see listening here a lot. And listening does not mean that you have to have a solution. It's just about building a connection, making sure they know they can talk to you. More relationship building, creating wins in the classroom, looking for those, focusing on the gains, accomplishments, no matter how little. Yep, small wins, so important in this moment. Creating a safe space. Keep them coming and read each other's. In the interest of time, I'm gonna move forward, but I love what you all are doing. And I think it's really inspiring that you're making time for that in this moment. And these are trauma-informed practices, right? Kind of, again, demystifying how we define trauma-informed. It's not a magic potion. It's baked into the way that we operate in a lot of our work. So now I'd like to jump into some kind of more tangible, like concrete trauma-informed practices that we would recommend you all building into the work that you're doing if you haven't already. And many of these might be things that you're already doing. So here's how we define trauma-informed practices, and we want to give credit to NCTSN, so the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Has done a lot of really great work on building trauma-informed practices. They have amazing resources. So would love to refer folks there. But making sure that staff are equipped to utilize trauma-informed practices and giving them the support they need to do this, to build self-efficacy and make sure that there are systems of support for staff as well. So can they recognize and respond to what is in front of them, right? Do they have the resources and skills to do that? Are staff infusing this into their work and into the climate in their sports programs, classrooms, etc., clubs? Are they working together with families, learning from young people themselves to make sure that they're maximizing safety for young people and making sure that young people have opportunities to thrive and be resilient, right? So it's pretty simple. It's not really overwhelming what we're looking for here, but it's making sure that we're building in systems of support for staff who are using trauma-informed practices and not skipping over them to get to kids, but making sure that they are given the support and that this work is infused throughout the entire school day. So some more concrete action steps here for you. I do want to make sure that we start this conversation around how you can help and what you can do around your own practice with yourself, right? So we've got a lot of shouting self-care at people. And Nikita Valeria said that shouting self-care at people who need community care is how we fail them. So I really believe in community care. How are we taking care of each other? How are we checking in on each other? How are we building that community of care around our staff, our students, et cetera? Because we've spent a really long time as an education community skipping over administrators, skipping over teachers, to get to students. And we really need to make sure that the people doing this work don't burn out in the process. And there's some self-compassion too. So I just want to kind of start with a note around checking in with yourself, making sure you're compassionate. You have also experienced this massive trauma. You may have experienced loss that you can define, loss you can't define. You've been working with students who are experiencing trauma, so don't downplay the impact of vicarious trauma. You've been working in the most difficult time in educational history, and things are just constantly changing. You learn to teach in a remote environment, run a school in a remote environment. It's really important to be compassionate with yourself and recognize what your wins are, and be really proud of the work that you've done to this point. Self-compassion is critically important. Thinking about ways, cat on the keyboard, I love that, thank you. Check in with yourself to gain insight into where you might be struggling, right? Find an accountability partner. So find some social supports that are needed, whether it's your team, whether it's someone on another grade level, administrators. How are you getting the support that you need? How are you building in social supports into your school, so teachers know that they feel well supported so that they can show up and do this work? And again, we all need predictability because our bodies have been exposed to some sort of trauma. So creating some sort of routine and setting boundaries where you can. I know when the constraints come from above and are really vertical, setting boundaries can be really difficult, but even if they're minor ways that we can set boundaries for our work, it'll help us to show up for students in a way that is better. And it will also help us to model for students what self-care, self-compassion, community care looks like. So much of what young people are learning about how to take care of themselves and how to show up in the world is how the adults show up in front of them. And so many students these days are talking about how stressed their teachers are, how short their teachers are with them. They see it regardless of whether or not we're trying to hide it. They're pretty intuitive. So it's really important for us to make opportunity and space to care for ourselves and each other. And then thinking about these 5 areas, I think is really important. And this comes from Doc Wayne's Champion Network, which is a youth-based therapy group, breaks down these sort of 5 principles of trauma-informed practices: safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment. So thinking about ways that we can build in physical safety for young people, or a sense of safety for young people, so that their guards are not up, that they feel safe in the classroom, and asking them what would make them feel safe psychologically and physically is really important. Giving them options or choice is really important. It makes them give them a sense of control. And them having increased control does not mean that we have less control, right? If I'm giving a young person an option, I'm going to give them options that I'm comfortable with. So if I give them 5 options, I'm comfortable with all of them, but they have a sense of choice and control. So giving them options is really, really helpful. Really giving them opportunities for collaboration and shared decision-making. Make sure that they trust you, they trust each other. In order to do that, there has to be clarity, consistency, and boundaries in place. For young people who have experienced trauma, their boundaries have often been crossed. So we have to model what it looks like to set boundaries, and those boundaries actually make them feel safer. Lack of boundaries can oftentimes be a trigger for young people who have experienced trauma, so it's important to recognize that. And then true empowerment, right? Thinking about what makes them feel validated, competent, and affirmed in who they are and how they authentically can show up at school. And these are these kind of 5 principles of trauma-informed practices and how we can support students and create trauma-informed environments. So it's just some tips for your own self-regulation, because again, it's really difficult to show up for young people who have experienced trauma if you don't have anything in your toolbox to show up for yourself. So thinking about and this goes for you and these go for your students, right? So thinking about for yourself, what does an emotional cool down look like? What does that look like for your students? Having things in your classroom and opportunities for them to take a moment of self-care or exercise or move in the classroom are really good ways to build this in to the work that we're already doing. And I think that with the constraints, we think that these practices take up a lot of time, but in most cases they take a minute or two or three or four or five. And so often that's less time than that we would waste in a classroom that on correcting misbehavior because people don't feel regulated or safe in the classroom. So in high intensity moments, right? So when you can't prevent things from happening, think about your own triggers, right? Think about what your self-care plan was, who it is that you're going to for additional support, trying to control your body language and tone, not to further trigger young people. Ask them what they would need, right? Sometimes we're, as educators, we're at a loss ourselves. Again, going back to that cool down space or time, allowing their prefrontal cortexes to regulate and calm down is really important. And talk about what you're noticing without assuming what they're feeling and without judgment. So this might look like, I notice that you're fidgeting a lot, or I notice that you're not really getting your work done. You're having a little bit of trouble focusing. What is it that you need, right? So rather than assuming that, it looks like you're bored, maybe they're not bored. You seem distracted, right? Not judging them, or you're not getting your work done. It looks like you don't care. Those are things that might trigger young people, create sort of a more adversarial interaction. We really want to assume the best in them and give them opportunities to correct and for us to offer support and build trust. And so after the moment, take a one away, right? Let them tell their story. So much of what we do in schools, because we're moving so quickly, is not giving young people voice to share their full story. And that builds a lot of resentment and takes away trust and takes away opportunities for trust as well. Express care. And that doesn't mean not holding the line. Like, you can say to a young person, the way you showed up in class today was not okay, but I'm really worried about you and I want to know how to support you. You can say both things in the same conversation, and holding the line and the boundaries, again, remember, that's a trauma-informed strategy too. They need to know what the line is and the boundary and how they can show up. But they also need to know that you care, validating their emotions, helping them to identify their triggers and collaborate on a plan. So help them to understand what happens when they're triggered, what it looks like when they're triggered, and what they do to get out of that during those moments. And then we want to break down referrals into internal and then external will be on the next slide. And then in schools, a lot of times that I've been in, everything feels like an emergency because everything's so urgent. But I want to talk about non-emergencies and then emergencies, right? So if things are an emergency and they're happening kind of sort of gradually, there's no imminent danger, think about what changes you're seeing in the young person. What are they sleeping? Are they talking about being really sleepy? Are they falling asleep in class? Are they having these like kind of non-violent emotional outbursts a lot? Are they having a hard time paying attention? And so maybe referring to in-house support when young people are dealing with that can be a good next step, because we want to make sure that it doesn't get much further. And then emergencies are when young people are in imminent danger themselves, or are hurting themselves or someone else. And so that's when we want to make sure that we act immediately. We're not looking at the behavior over time, suicidal ideation or attempts, and we're referring to our in-house support. So really making sure that people are aware of what is an emergency and a non-emergency and how you might respond to that, I think is really important, are important distinctions to make. And so in the moment, we need to kind of do a internal check, right? So take a deep breath, think about your body language. This can be really jarring for us when a young people is expressing something, what that they are going to hurt themselves or hurt someone else, or they're being disrespectful to us. But taking a deep breath can be really difficult. I taught middle school, and I can tell you that there are a number of times I almost lost it on my students because of how that sort of response makes you feel. But taking a breath and taking a moment yourself as an adult and a human is really important for doing this work. Thinking about what your reporting responsibilities are, right? So we're all mandated reporters. We have our internal protocol. So don't freak out, just think about what that protocol is and respond accordingly. And again, thinking back to what happens in a non-emergency versus what happens in an emergency, and responding differently in both situations. Validate the concerns of young people, again, validating their emotions, communicating closely with counseling staff, internal or external, to share what you've seen and observed. You, even if you aren't a mental health expert, have observed something, and 9 out of 10 times your gut is indicative of something, right? Even if it's not what you thought it was, you don't have to be a diagnostician. You just have to know that there's a change and that there's something that's concerning, and it's better to bring it to someone's attention and express care than not, right? And so if someone is in immediate threat, consider calling emergency service. The 988 number is coming out, I believe, over the summer, which is for mental health emergencies. There's a crisis text line, and we'll share some resources at the end. So for emergencies, it's really important to get help immediately. And then talking about external referrals. So thinking about the family history and their knowledge of mental health resources, as well as stigma, is really important. So approaching families in a way that they're going to receive it is really important. Collaborate with the young person themselves, right? Like ask them what they would like to do. Ask them if they would like for you to be part of a conversation. Use recommendations that are culturally responsive, that consider the family's lifestyle, logistics. Do they have a car? Is it really close? Maybe telehealth would be a better option for them if there aren't resources in your community. So think about who it is that you're referring to. And it's better if your school has a list of community resources that you're comfortable with, so that it's a warm referral versus it being something that's really cold. And again, practicing self-care afterwards. This work is really, really hard. It's important that you take a breath, a moment for yourself, that you again are expressing some self-compassion for the fact that you've done a really hard thing. And then check back after the referral to make sure that the young person and their family didn't experience any roadblocks, because the system can be really difficult to navigate. And then return back to self-care. Always think about leaning, and I won't say just self-care, but leaning on the resources that you have available to you. And so that was a lot that I shared with you, and this session could easily have been an hour and a half, but want to give folks an opportunity to reflect and think about some takeaways. So in the chat, if you could write 1 to 2 things that you're taking away from this training or you'll continue reflecting on in your work, or share what are some new principles you can incorporate into your practice or your schools. And then I'll pass it back to Glenn to close us out. So Sash said, be more aware of changes in my students. Building relationships, staying open-minded. Awesome, keep them coming. Setting better positive boundaries. Trauma-informed practices aren't mystical, we can do this. Love that. The way you phrase statements such as, that wasn't okay, but I'm worried about you. Awesome. Readily listen, continued, more focused attention to my trans students. Wonderful. Let them talk, but also still be firm. Wonderful. Good takeaways here. My reactions to my students' needs, sharing trauma-informed practices with building staff. And we'll share this back afterwards so that you all have these. The visual about the amygdala and prefrontal cortex. Awesome. Yeah, it's a good way, breaking it down for young people and helping them understand what happens in their brain is great too. I've done it with kids as young as 8 years old, and they love that. Asking students how we can help. They have the answers so often. Emotion because their reaction. My reaction can cause their reaction. Yeah. I've had those moments too when I've definitely been part of triggering students. Doesn't mean you're a bad teacher. It means that you're human. And the only way that we move past this is by reflecting on how our practices impact them. Wonderful. Keep them coming. I love these takeaways. And I'll keep reading afterwards. These are great. Thank you all so much for sharing these. So we've got a 25-year-old. Welcome. I'm just kidding. But I think not a lot of folks know that brain development doesn't stop until 24. Don't wait till the weekend or spring break. Yes, teachers are so good at waiting until the break comes. Like, I can't wait till this break, and then you'll take care of yourself, building it in. Thank you all so much for sharing. Glenn, I'm going to pass it back to you to close out with resources. While Glenn's sharing, y'all can share questions in the chat, and we will spend the last 5 minutes or so answering them.
Great, thank you, Wenimo. That was a lot to take in, and the feedback here is fantastic, what everybody's taking away, and this is really good. So here are some resources that you can use that might be helpful in educating yourself more on trauma-informed education practices, including resource centers, JED's Resource Center for Families and Communities, our Seize the Awkward campaign, the coronavirus edition, our Set to Go for Families, which is the transition from high school to college, Love is Louder, the JED's Parent Conversation Guide. So if you go to jedfoundation.org, there's a whole range of resources that are available for you for the school as well as for the students. So that's a great location for information to further this learning in this to your students and school. And then just want to open it up, as when I was saying, to any questions that you have about trauma-informed practices, about the JED Foundation, the work that we do, about JED High School, anything that we can help, just drop it into the chat, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
Wenimo, Glenn, thank you both so much for your presentation today. Really appreciated it. Great information, great strategies. Love all of the suggestions in the chat and what's been taken away. As Glenn said, now's your time to ask any open questions for Glenn and Wenimo. Type it into chat or go to the bottom of your screen and raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question on the microphone. We'll be here to support you for the next several minutes.
No questions. They might come in. Oh, kids in divorce. Yeah, divorce is definitely on that list of household dysfunction is how it's defined in the research. But it is a trauma. But it is one that if students have support, they can definitely overcome pretty easily. Reunification therapy. Interesting. Would poverty itself be considered an adverse childhood experience? That's a good question. So there's actually new research on adverse community experiences or adverse community events, and poverty, racism, discrimination are considered kind of like root cause adverse community events. And there's been some research on that because they've wanted to look at why exposure to trauma is higher when you correlate it with poverty. So in that sense, because it's connected to those root causes, I would say yes, it's not on the original list, but there's some research to support that poverty increases those negative impacts in the same way that the other adverse childhood experiences do. It's a good question. Are there resources specifically for elementary age students? So we're focused on high school, but again, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, I'll type that in the chat, NCTSN, has really great resources for children under the age of 17, so like sort of across the spectrum. So the National Traumatic just in the interest of time, because we have 2 minutes left, I just want to jump to our last slide here, but please keep the questions coming and I can answer in the chat. See you, Glenn.
Yeah, so if there's more, if you want more information on Jett High School, specifically in the programming we do, there's my contact information and there's a link to that comprehensive approach that we talked about is in that link also. I'll talk to you about those 7 core domains that we focus on and where trauma-informed practices fits within there. So again, please feel free to go to the site for information, reach out to us. We'll be happy to help in any way that we can. I see there's a few more questions coming on.
Thanks, Glenn. And will we be able to share this Google slide deck with all the active links afterwards?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So in my follow-up email, you can expect tomorrow we'll get the link to the recording, link to the evaluation, and a link to these slides, which contain the internal links that you need to access the resources. So thank you both for that.
Of course. Thank you all so much for having us. Thank you for your questions and your engagement in the chat. Really would love to keep in touch and hope that you all consider joining Jett High School. Thank you, Arlen, for having us.
My pleasure. You both did great. Appreciated the presentation. We'll have to work together again soon.
Look forward to it. Thank you very much.
All right. Everyone is free to click on the Leave Meeting Room at the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and we'll be following up with an email tomorrow with the recording link, the evaluation link, and a link to the slides. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening.